It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague Ilana Kaufman. Ilana is the JCRC Public Affairs and Community Engagement Director for the East Bay. She's a former educator and is a leading thinker in the Jewish community on issues of equity and justice. Ilana will be moderating our panel this evening.
All right, good evening, everybody. So first, just a public service announcement. I'm really aware of what evening it is, and I want to make a promise to all of you, which is that I have a tab pulled open on this Kindle, if I can get back to my page, where I will both manage all of the questions that come in this evening, and then I will also intermittently report the scores out. And I realize that in terms of designing the lesson for this evening, it is a total disaster that we have you all plugged into your phones, because you are nothing but incentivized to be distracted by the game. And we have three amazing, amazing panelists this evening, and so I would ask, and I will promise you, if we can focus on the content of the evening, I will make sure you all are well apprised of any serious critical warrior situation, wins, losses, injuries, and we've already agreed that if there is, God forbid, an injury, we will stop and have a multi-denominational prayer moment for our team. And so that is what I would promise you this evening. We have the privilege of having three incredible colleagues here this evening. Jeremy, can you? And I would like to introduce them. I would invite you all to come up to the seats. There will be, I'm going to give introductions, and we're going to go right into questions, and then I really want to encourage you to use the devices that you have this evening, thank you, to send in questions. They will be sent to our team, who will send them to me, and I will have them here, and I will share them with our panelists. Thank you for being here. I'd like to welcome Eva Paterson. She is the president and co-founder of the Equal Justice Society, a legal organization transforming the nation's consciousness on race through the law, social science, and the arts. Eva is a self-described beneficiary of affirmative action, is a passionate person who has supported equal educational opportunities for a very long time. Eva has co-authored several landmark lawsuits in support of affirmative action, the federal lawsuit challenging California's Proposition 209, the successful litigation against UC Berkeley's admissions policy limiting access of students of color, and an amicus brief in Grutter versus Bollinger, in which the United States Supreme Court upheld the race-conscious admissions policy at the University of Michigan Law School. I'd like to welcome you this evening. Thank you, Eva. I'd like to welcome Ryan Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Education Trust West, a research and advocacy organization focused on educational justice and the high academic achievement of all California students. Ryan focused specifically and particularly on those students of color and those living in poverty. Ryan is also an Anna E. Casey Children and Family Fellow, and I'd like to welcome you this evening, Ryan. Thank you. And finally, I'd like to welcome our colleague and friend Sheryl Davis, who has more than 20 years experience working as an educator and community leader in the San Francisco Bay Area, and specifically in San Francisco. Ms. Davis is the founding director of MoMagic, a collaborative partnership of a number of organizations addressing community issues together. Sheryl continues her work in service in both youth and families as the executive director of MoMagic and of Collective Impact, a community-based organization in the Western Addition in San Francisco. I'd like to welcome you this evening. We're going to get right into questions, and we're going to start with the achievement gap. And I'd like to start with you, Ryan, if that's okay. So many of us have heard the term achievement gap, and we've also heard the term opportunity gap, but we're not really clear on what those are, what they mean, and their implications. Can you tell us what they are, give us a sense of what the difference is, and what you want us to know as we begin to think about these issues as we start our evening?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I'm happy to be here. As she mentioned, I'm Ryan Smith, Executive Director of Education Trust West. We're an ed research policy and advocacy organization dedicated to closing achievement opportunity gap. So this is up our wheelhouse. I'm also a Lakers fan, so I remember, I grew up, even though my family's from East Palo Alto, and I grew up in LA, so I don't remember the consensus around all of this Dove stuff, but I'm excited to support the Doves tonight for this congregation. So, one of the things that we talk about, and I like what Rabbi Heath talked, mentioned this idea about knowledge really being the catalyst for action. And I thought that grounds our conversation really well, because we really think of data, the democratization of data being the catalyst for change, meaning we need to know where we start if we're really going to change disparities. So when we talk about opportunity gaps versus achievement gaps, sometimes those get conflated. But when we talk about the achievement gap, we talk about the disparities that we see as far as outcomes for students. And one disparity that we actually took on our data equity walk, we actually do this exercise in communities where we take a gallery walk of data. You'll see here, if you look at the Oracle Arena, you'll see that the number of California Black and Latino students who do not graduate with their cohort every year could fill Oracle Arena 3 times over. And if you know, that's 18,000 seats. Imagine what that really means. So we talk about achievement gaps. We talk about how many students are meeting standards, how many students are graduating. And we know there's a gap usually between students of color, low-income students, and their upper income and white counterparts. And we see it across the nation. It's a trend that continues to persist. And although we've seen a narrowing of the gaps, right now in California, if we continue the trend we're at right now, it would take over 140 years to actually close the achievement gap. So we have some work to do. When we talk about opportunity gaps, we're actually talking about access issues, lack of access to things like resources, quality teachers, effective teachers in the classroom, lack of funds in some communities as well. Lack of, I had someone mention, I've worked with students and tutored them, and many of them have never actually been on a field trip, or many of them have never actually seen the beach, right? So when we talk about the opportunities that some students receive compared to others, we still see a large opportunity gap. So think of achievement as outcomes and opportunities potentially as inputs when we're talking about student success.
Thank you. Sheryl, let's go to you and pick up that ball, if you will. There are many initiatives that you're working on to improve opportunities for learning for students of color inside and outside of the classroom. Can you give us some examples of programs that are working to address the achievement gap and the opportunity gap for kids who are engaged and enrolled in schools? And what would you prioritize inside and outside of school to address the gap of educational opportunities for students of color?
So again, I'm grateful to be here tonight. Thank you all for taking time to be here. I grew up in the Bay Area, but I'm originally from the South. So I have this strong affinity for what was very much community and engagement, and also the foundation of the church, right? And the role that it played, not from necessarily a religious point of view. So when we talk about what works, I think there's been a struggle to really talk about very concretely, these are the things that people should do. And this, because it's not easily replicated, right, in terms of neighborhood and community. But I always go back to Benjamin Mays and the Negroes Church, where they talk about a couple of things. One is programs that are successful and that make the big difference are the ones that have high expectations. Benjamin Mays talks about it's not failure, but low aim that is the sin. That's the thing that destroys us all. He talks about the tragedy is not in missing your dreams or not achieving your dreams, but having no dreams, right? That is the tragedy. And so I think the programs that provide a space for kids to dream and to believe that they can actually achieve those dreams, that set this expectation that you can achieve something, those are the ones that we find most successful. I think about some of the work that we're doing in schools, where we go in and create a space and a place where we validate the lives of those kids regardless of what their ethnicity or race is, regardless of what their socioeconomic background is, but that we value their experiences and find a way to celebrate that and to find literature and opportunities for them to feel important and valued and valuable. Those are things that are successful. So I think about African American Male Achievement Program in Oakland with Chris Chapman. What they've done really great is the Manhood Development Program, where they bring young people in and they celebrate and they talk about the history of where they come from, but then they also talk about setting high expectations, coming in and believing that they can do that. And so what we've done in San Francisco is something similar. We go into the public school, we create this space, we create these dialogues, the vocabulary, the conversations, and then we've done an author series where we bring in folks like John Lewis, and then there's a new writer, G. Watkins, where this year I found kids who could not read, right? And so usually when I taught for 20 years, kids who don't read well don't usually like when you do round robin or you say, let's take a turn to read. I was blown away by this one young lady, we taped it, who struggled after every word to read, but the book resonated with her in such a way that she did not care. She was not embarrassed about struggling over the words because the story was hers, and all of a sudden she felt seen, and she felt important, and she felt empowered to have a conversation. And to me, that makes all the difference. The programs that create that space for your life and your life story to be important, give you meaning and purpose, and the programs that say, we believe you can do something, and then provide the support for that, help do that. Right?
Excuse me, is it possible to ask a question if it's timely, or you're bundling those?
No. Can you send it into the
I can't figure out how to do that, that's fine.
I'll give it cards.
We have cards.
We have cards. But if you can send up a card, I'd be happy to leave it in. So we thank you, Sheryl. And Eva, we heard from Sheryl, high expectations, being validated through the curriculum, having your narrative and your story validated. We also know that smaller schools, smaller class sizes, a challenging and rigorous curriculum with high expectations, and highly, highly qualified teachers are essential to the success of students and the school experience. We know this, yet still students of color are not getting their needs met. What's going on here from your perspective?
Well, I'm really glad to be here too. I always feel if I'm in a house of the Lord, I'm in the right place. And I think it's very important that you're taking on the issue of race. And I really was struggling with how to talk about this today, because sometimes if you talk, and I have to say, you're going to hear me talking about white people. Some of my best friends are white people, so don't get all alarmed. Doug Kahn can vouch for me. But if you talk with white people about race, people sometimes get defensive and shut down, and that's not what I want to happen, but I want to be honest about what's going on. And I think part of the problem is just straight up racism, but it's very complicated now. We had a black president, so we're post-racial. Everything's fine. What are you people talking about? You're always complaining. We now have a presidential candidate who says a judge should be disqualified because he's Mexican. Excuse me? That's just insane. You have now people who were white supremacists who are coming out from under their rocks and feeling just the dog whistle that used to be out there about race is now a bullhorn. And part of the reason for what's happening to kids of color is because we have a stratified society. I've never been to Los Altos Hills. I thought I had fallen down the rabbit hole. What is this place? A Tesla company? And everybody has Range Rovers? Yesterday morning I was in Antioch, which is way away in Contra Costa County, and a lot of people from Oakland have been dispossessed from Oakland because people from San Francisco are pushing into Oakland, and people in Oakland are pushing out into Contra Costa County. And a lot of what's going on is around class, because a lot of my friends, black friends, their kids are in great schools. They're going to the great colleges. So a lot of it's class, but people of color, often black people and Latinos, are often disproportionately poor. And so that's part of it as well. It's also about segregated housing. If there were a lot, I don't know how many black people there are in Los Altos Hills.
We actually got, I think it's 148 before we came. We're data people, so we moved. Yes. So I'm right about that, Shalina, right?
Well, there's 151 and a half.
Okay, maybe.
I would imagine the kids of those people are doing just fine. But there's segregated housing, not necessarily because people hate black people or Latinos. We're very segregated, and so that's part of the problem as well. It was very interesting, I don't know who said this, but I think it was the rabbi who said that the kids of professionals hear more words, and that's going to give them a broader vocabulary and the like. But we've had a system, Proposition 209, which has shut off access to higher education for Latinos and African Americans. You should know that there were 800 Latinos and African Americans with perfect 4.0 averages who did not get into Cal after Proposition 209. So the big myth is that there's these unqualified people who would be getting in, but that's not the case at all. Because think about this, in Los Altos Hills, there are probably AP classes. If you get an A in an AP class, you get a 5. In many schools of low-income folks, there are AP classes. So if you have a 4-point, you're fabulous, but you just can't compete with the people coming from these schools. So there's that. And then there's another issue that just isn't racial at all, and it's an ideological one, in that we have we have a situation where government is being demeaned, where teachers are demeaned, where the power of the teachers' unions have been diminished, and where people go, well, I'm not going to take my kid, I'm not going to put my kids into public schools, and that's a perfectly valid point of view. So during the course of the evening, I'm just going to give you snapshots, but those are some of the snapshots that make me conclude why kids of color who are poor are getting such a run.
And Brian, just a very quick data question. What's the percentage of kids in the United States who attend public school?
That is a good question, and don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
But I can get you the data.
Well, and maybe we can look it up while we're having this conversation, just so that we can understand the scale for this context and for this conversation. I want to offer a question to all of you, and anyone please take a try at it. When we talk about programs like universal preschools, charter schools, college readiness programs like College Track, what's the value of those in affecting in a positive way the opportunity gap and the achievement gap? Is there any data on that or any experiences that tell us that those are beneficial?
So I will say this, because I think we're getting to the crux of, well, these gaps have persisted. And I actually heard I remember seeing this data 20 years ago, right? So why is it not changing when we've invested more money? It feels like we've invested more attention in education. And we should talk about, number one, about systems, what we do within systems. I think this is an important conversation. Because oftentimes in this conversation, usually people start going, well, what's happening? And people start to point outward. No one wants to point inside of what's happening in the room. They go, well, it's the parents out there. They should be doing more. Or it's broadly just a poverty issue. But we make decisions in systems that actually place barriers in front of Black, brown, and poor children. As we mentioned before, we make decisions where we place AP classes and physics classes and calculus classes. It's a travesty right now that in our country, schools with the highest concentration of Black and brown youth have the lowest access to physics and calculus, which is totally the reverse if you are white and upper income, where you have the highest access to physics and calculus. We know those are considered within a college prep coursework. Those are decisions we make. We decide disciplinary policies that tend to push out Black, brown, and poor children. Alone, the UCLA Civil Rights Project said that in 1 year alone, just on suspension expulsion, there were almost 18 million hours lost of instruction time, just because we suspend and expel students and send them out of the classroom. Like, those things are things that we do. And the reason I bring this up is we have to start talking about systemic change. What are the things we can scale? I love College Track. I think it's a phenomenal program. I also know it costs a lot of money per student. So it's great when we celebrate a program where 100 students succeed, but we need programs where 1 million students succeed based on the dollars we currently have. So when we're talking about large-scale change, we have to talk about systems. We also, since we're talking about race, we have to talk about institutional racism, systemic racism, things that we're doing right now that absolutely happen because the system was designed to do so. And that's a really important conversation to have. We recently came out with a report called Black Lives Matter. I think you all have a copy of it. But it was the late, great One of my favorite icons, Julian Bond, who would have been 76 in August, civil rights advocate. He said, violence is black children going to school for 12 years and receiving 6 years worth of education. And he said this about schools in the 60s. So when we talk about movements like Black Lives Matter and what happens in criminal justice, we can see the comparisons. And in fact, if the deaths of unarmed black youth tell those students that their lives matter less, then many of the experiences of black and brown students tell them that their education and their minds matter less as well.
I just to kind of piggyback on that, to really talk about the systems change, you talk about college track, and there are a couple of things that for me, from a community kind of on the ground level, that we need to talk about in terms of systems. Those programs work great for kids that are probably going to be okay anyway, because their parents are doing what it takes to get them in that program, their parents are aware of that program, they sign them up, they do what it takes to keep them in that program. They're already motivated. Those kids are on track in some ways already. When we talk about universal preschool, for me, in a lot of ways, if we don't change the system, it just means that we start the pipeline to prison a little bit earlier, right? Because I have a student that I've been working with that has been getting suspended for school for, I worked in Convent and Stewart Hall in San Francisco, I worked for Schools of the Sacred Heart, French American, and I worked in preschool at very kind of affluent preschools, and the things that I saw happening that we call developmentally appropriate, when they happen in the preschool in the Western Addition, they're called perverted or they're demonic, right? So to see that, where in one place they're so curious and they're challenging. So if we're not changing the system, it just means that we start the issues that we have at an earlier time. And then we talked a little bit about like who's in public school or what that looks like. San Francisco is 53% white. 13% of the students in San Francisco Unified are white. So that tells us a story about what's happening within the system, right? And then we think about 7.6 of the students are African American, but 45% of the students who are being suspended or who are being disciplined are African American, right? So there's definitely something that's happening that we need to kind of take a look at in terms of what's happening with the system.
And I want to take your piece around the school to prison pipeline. And Eva, I'd like to ask you, in terms of what we hear and understand about the school to prison pipeline, from your vantage point, what are the school policies that are in place that are triggering or contributing to this pipeline that you are aware of and that you fought for advocacy around? What do we need to know?
There are a number of problems. There are very subjective criteria for suspending somebody. For example, you can suspend someone for willful defiance. That's completely vague, and it's misused, so that's a real problem. Another problem we found is that many of the police in the school are in uniforms, and the social science information indicates that if kids see police in uniforms on their campus, it interferes with their cognitive abilities and their abilities to really function and learn. We also learned in one school district that many of the police officers are former prison guards. So if they are coming from a situation where they see disproportionate numbers of black and brown inmates, this internalizes a sense in their heads that black and brown folks are criminal and are to be watched very carefully. We've done a lot of work on this. I'm a litigator, and I said if I had a tattoo, it would say "born to sue." But suing somebody, as a friend of mine put it, is a line in the sand. And you have clients coming to you saying, "Our kids are getting thrown out." There's that one of the charts up there talks about the people who don't graduate from high school. If you miss one day of class, your chance of graduating diminishes horribly. In one of the cases where we've sued a school district, there was a young Latino kid who was in a free breakfast program. He took an extra piece of banana bread and he was suspended for theft. That just makes no sense. Some of this is attributable to the zero tolerance program, which just says get them out of here, get them out of here. It's so complicated. Part of what we've learned is that teachers often are not taught classroom management skills. it's very complicated because we don't want to make the teachers the villains, because many teachers are white women, and they're going to encounter large black men and women, and we scare people. We do a lot of work with social science and MRIs, and the same part of your brain that lights up when you see a snake or a spider is the part of your brain that lights up when you see a black face. You're not aware of this, but you're acting on it. And so a smallish white woman teacher, big kid acting out, the teacher's freaked out. Get him out of here, the teachers don't feel safe. So there have to be better ways of dealing with people who are acting out. There's a program officer at California Endowment named Castle Redmond, and he has been very much an advocate of trauma. I'm going to get the term wrong, but the basic idea is that there's a kid coming to school, hair not combed, acting crazy. The kid may be coming from just a hellish situation at home, but you don't know that, and you're just going, he's disrupting my class, get him out of here. So there's a notion going about that you need to kind of understand what's going on in the child's environment, and many people don't do that. There was a recent study done by Jason Akamfua, who was a PhD out of Stanford, and he did something that was brilliant because he didn't talk about race. He talked about the fact that teachers need to develop empathy for the students, and as the teachers developed empathy and mutual respect, the percentage of suspensions went down. There are some school districts who are getting rid of suspensions altogether. Some school districts have gotten rid of the willful defiance category. Another thing I just want to say is that, and this was interesting to me, students of color with disabilities are even more susceptible to being suspended because people just don't know what to do. So it's important that we're having this conversation. Some of my colleagues don't have Born to Sue on their arm and are going in a more peaceful way and working with unions and teachers. And what we were meeting with California Teachers Association representatives yesterday, the teachers are hungry for information. They don't want to be overloaded because they don't have enough resources, but they're hungry for some simple interventions which will make them feel safe and allow them to do what they became teachers to do, to take care of kids and we might say love the kids. But I was at a conference and we talked about we want to love the kids. Oh yes, that's what we want to do. Are we allowed to say that? And so there's a lot going on, and the policies and procedures are being lifted up, and we're beginning to figure out what to do to reverse it.
Right. I want to go back to talking about the importance of being in school for just a moment, and then I want to talk about the classroom experience. And Ryan, I want to just, I want to make sure I get this quote right, but there was a UCLA Civil Rights Project report that states that if we ignore the discipline gap, we will be unable to close the achievement gap. The report goes on to say that we estimate U.S. public school children lost nearly 18 million days of instruction in just 1 year. In just 1 year of school because of the exclusionary discipline practices. Can you talk a little bit about those practices in terms of the data? And what are the other models besides exclusionary discipline that you've seen successfully working in schools?
Yep, so a couple of things. And you mentioned the school to prison pipeline, so if I can take a step back and just talk about how many people have heard of the school to prison pipeline? How many of us have a good sense of what we think it means? Okay, well that's a good piece. Well, I have one data point that illustrates, by the way, 9% of our students in the United States go to public schools.
So that's an important context piece for us all.
And I also should know that, once again, charter schools are 90%. 90%. And you should also know that charter schools, because some people conflate that charters are not public, those are traditional public schools. So they're in that public school number. So a really interesting data point that illustrates in the school prison pipeline. I just turned 35, but for a young African American man who is 34, if he does not have a high school diploma, his risk of incarceration is 68%. If he has a high school diploma, that number drops in half. And he has a college degree, that number becomes non-existent. And that means, so I know I look older than 35, I know it's been a hard, civil rights work. Anyway, I will say this, that affects me deeply. And we talked a little about Proposition 209, which is affirmative action, and I was actually a part of the class at UCLA after affirmative action was implemented. 6,000 freshmen, 27 black men who got into that school on academics alone.
Say that again.
6,000 freshmen, 27 black men. We wore endangered species shirts. We really were like, hey, you're a black male student at UCLA? Like, there's not many of us. Those numbers were fewer than in 1967. So it's really real. So when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, we talk about how we have things like willful defiance, suspension, expulsion. Those things are pushing students out of schools and pushing them literally into the prison system. And we've been doing some really good work. So our research in Black Lives Matter actually uplifts some of the things that are happening. I should also say this really quickly, because I consider myself a feminist. We always talk about this being a young men of color issue, but this also affects young black and brown girls. In fact, young black girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than young white girls across the country. So I hate that this has become such a gendered conversation. It's really a community conversation. A couple things that are working. Number one, we're implementing a lot more restorative justice programs, which is not just about, hey, a student's not doing well, let's get them out, let's not have them go into school, which is very counterintuitive, right? You still want a student who's not doing well in school and learning. So it's really about, let's take a half step and go, what's happening? What's the context of why this student may not be doing well? And one instance in Watts, we found that a parent did not, and I'm gonna be real quick, a student didn't come with his backpack, didn't come with pens, and the teacher said, you're out of here. Restorative practice, someone went back and said, well, why didn't you come? And they said, you know what? My parents actually has a drug issue and actually took away my books, pens, I don't know where they're at. But I wasn't gonna say that in the classroom in front of the rest of my peers. So when you take a step back and go, well, what's happening, and have a conversation. You also see positive behavior and intervention supports as well. I'm over my 4 minutes on the stuff. Thank you. Oh, I still have more time? I had 10 seconds. Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay, the Warriors are up by 3. And I've got you, we are somewhere deep in the 3rd quarter, I think. I can't see the time right now, but we're about, thank you, you're welcome.
And how's Kobe doing? He's not.
And I want to encourage you all, if you have questions and you don't want to type them in your phones, let us know and send up a card, and I'd be happy to incorporate it in. But please feel free to send us up some questions, either over the digital or on the cards. And if you need a card, just raise your hand and someone will bring you one. I want to talk about the classroom experience. And I want to start with you, Sheryl. When you come into schools and you watch our young people in their learning environments, paint a picture for us of what you see in terms of their classroom, or young people of color, in terms of their classroom experience. What are they experiencing in terms of content, approach to learning? What are they experiencing in terms of being having access to role models? What are they experiencing in terms of cultural relevant experiences, race and racism, and why is all that important?
I will say we started doing more school groups this year, really because what we are seeing are fewer and fewer people of color in the schools that have a high population of students of color. So students do not identify immediately with their teachers or with the environment, and likewise the teachers don't identify with the young people and their experiences. The first thing off the top that blew my mind this year was we came in and we say, let's really talk about setting goals and talking about what we want to achieve, but at the same time asking young people, what is it you want? Why are you here? And we asked a senior that question. And this is someone, 13 years in school, has gone through this process, and she said to me, she said to my folks, my staff people, oh my God, nobody has ever asked me, why am I here? What do I want to do? And it was, my staff came back and they were so emotional because I had said, this is the year. You do not go into a classroom saying, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to help you, and this is how I'm going to change your life. You go in and you find out what their life is, right? You find out if they want their life changed. You find out what's going on at home. We did another, I was so disappointed. We tend to go in, just because I come from a community where anytime we had an event, just like we have here, there was food, there was some kind of reward, there was something for, we value your time, we value you. And we were going into schools and it was 8:30 in the morning, we were bringing food, and I had a teacher come to me and say, the kids are saying they want to come to this group because you have food. So we really think that you should use the food as a reward and don't give it to them until they come to like 4 meetings. And I was like, why would we do that? And she said, well, they were really excited about a bagel. I said, you know what, if somebody's excited about a bagel, they can have a bagel. Why are we, and we got into this kind of back and forth about whether we should be bringing food. And I'm like, if kids are excited about food, why are we arguing about this? And so that is I feel like there's this sense within the school about what a kid is worth and what their value is and what they deserve, and having to prove you deserve a bagel or an apple is ridiculous, right? And that has been the struggle, to talk about like what's important to you, what's going on. We did some, again, workshops where the kids, again, had not seen themselves in the material, they had not seen themselves in the school, they had not seen themselves in the classroom, and we went through some different poems, Langston Hughes and other things, and talked about like, what do you get from this and what do you sense? And one student, this was an 8th grader, who said, I think this sounds like depression. So the group said, what do we think? Well, does anybody know someone who's depressed? And the student said, from this, I think my mom is depressed. This is what happens when she comes home. And so having the space to really talk about the social, emotional, because we're so focused on the academic, it's lost. We're not talking about the bare, basic human necessity. And that's what I think we forget in the classroom. The whole child, which I remember people weren't happy about when that used to be the curriculum. It was like the whole child and whole language. But there is something missing because we're not looking at the whole person in the classroom. And I think that, to me, is the biggest thing that I see missing. It's not just about what's on the walls. It's not just about what's in the books. It's about what's in the heart. And there's not enough love in terms of why we're here. It's not about just getting, all of these phonetic sounds down. It's about, do you understand why we're even here and why we do this work?
Thank you. Eva, I'd like to go to you if that's okay. And I want to keep on this theme of classroom experience. And I want to sort of have the frame be about quality, equitable school experiences. Through that frame, can you tell us a little bit about the policies and practices that you're aware of that either support quality, equitable experiences or lean into, or in some cases reinforce, bias experience or racist experience?
I consider myself to be like the spiritual godchild of Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, Jack Greenberg, Bob Carter, Constance Baker Motley. In 1929, they decided to take on Plessy versus Ferguson, take on separate but equal. You can't do that. The Supreme Court's whack. The Supreme Court had just gone to the White House to watch a screening of Birth of a Nation with Woodrow Wilson, the entire Supreme Court. So people like, you're just nuts. But what they did is they brought in social science, and they did a number of experiments to show the corrosive impact that segregating the races had on white and black people. At the time, it was just white and black. It gave black people a false sense of inferiority and white people a false sense of superiority, and they were able to demonstrate that with the famous doll baby experiment that was done by Dr. Kenneth Clark. He had a black doll and a white doll and asked the kids, who's the good doll, who's the bad doll? And black and white kids always pointed to the white doll as the good doll and always pointed to the black doll as the bad doll. That experiment was replicated in Bronx, probably 10 years ago, same results, which is very discouraging. So I won't go into all the details, but one of the things we've been working on in my organization is the social science of bias. And we found a number of things that we're taking into the schools, which I touched on a little bit before, that are helping us understand what goes on. You said that you look older. Black people are generally seen as older than we really are, and it starts with children. You may remember Tamir Rice being shot. They said, the police officer said he looks like he's 20. He was 12. if you show a picture of a white kid of a certain age and a black kid of a certain age, they will always assume the black kid is older. There's something else that I'll riff off what Ryan was saying about girls, and this blew my mind. They had functional MRIs, and they showed people pictures of black men and black women. And when people looked at a black woman's face, they thought that she looked more, they initially associated her with being masculine. And so we are seen as more masculine than white women are, and that has a concomitant effect on who gets disciplined. We're seen as more threatening. So black girls are disciplined in numbers off the chart. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a black superintendent, and she said something that was just so startling but so real, and nobody says this. Many people are just afraid of kids of color. And it was like, that was so simple and so profound. But if you're afraid of the kids of color and the kids like acting out, you're going to want to get them out of the class because you're scared. And I'm not minimizing people's fears, but one of the things we're trying to do is to get people to understand what's going on in their psyches, which will impact the disproportionate suspension and expulsion of kids. Other things that we have found out is that, and this always hurts me to say this, but many white people, when they see me, will associate my visage and self with that of an ape. We are not often seen as fully humans. So if that's how people are actually feeling about us in the classroom, they're going to be not treating us as people who should be in the classroom. This stuff's deep. Sometimes I don't want to leave my house because I know how people are looking at me and they're not even aware of it. I went up into the other place and I walked in and a woman looked like that, and you're going, well, maybe she just doesn't know me, or is it she's afraid because I'm a black person here? And to speak personally, this is what you go through all day, every day. Why are things happening to me? You know, I'm doing well in my life, but what about a little kid when someone flinches when they come towards him? So I hope this is responsive to what you were asking me, but one of the things we're trying to do is to get people to understand the psychological, emotional, spiritual dimensions of this. And it's mainly people who don't want to be racist or biased. There's some people who do. We've been seeing them in the last year. But most people don't. And so we're trying to get people to understand why they do these things. And then we're trying to come up with interventions. This Jason, the empathy thing is one way to deal with it. One thing you can do in the classroom is to have teachers write down why they're suspending someone or expelling someone, because you have to stop and think about it. So that would be my response.
Thank you, and I want to just, I want to piggyback and add a question that just came from the audience around this question of experiences and perceptions of Black and brown students, the schooling experiences of Blacks and Latinos, and why are we talking about Blacks and Latinos and not talking about Asians?
So, you know, it's funny, I've been working on a project for the city. We've been calling it Black to the Future. And so part of this is looking at Black people in San Francisco and what does that look like and how can we make sure that they are still there in the future. And part of this, doing this study, one of the things we found is this, and again, to me, it's back to this idea, notion of place and space and credit and value in your heritage and your culture. And one of the things that that came up during this study is that there has not been, even though we know what the numbers are, we think about San Francisco, the numbers match with who's in the community and who's in the school when it comes to the Asian population. It's around 34, 33% in the school and in the city. But they talked about, in this research that I was looking at, they talked about how there's been minimal study on what's going on with the Asian students in school and what is happening that makes them, that the larger population of them are very successful. Right? And that we just assume that that's just, you know, a cultural thing, but there has not been an intensive, really deep study about what makes them successful when they are coming in, and that they are immigrants and they're coming at a disadvantage and they're living in poverty a lot of times, but yet they still have this push to kind of go to school and make it happen, but nobody's really studied it. And for me, when I looked at that and I thought back to what we have and what's going on within our communities, there is, when certain folks come in, there's already the assumption that they're going to do well. Whereas with a lot of our students, the assumption is they're not going to do well. And it's this idea that I said earlier where I saw very much firsthand, like what I was taught in school about what was developmentally appropriate. And when I worked at French American, where the teachers there are licensed from France, like they come in with their true culture. And this idea that we are very, you know, I always said I was so much a prude that when I became pregnant, I didn't want to tell my principal that I was pregnant because I was like, what is he going to think about what I've been doing? So I was really embarrassed to like have this conversation. And there was very much a different culture within the European stratus that it was like, kids go in the bathroom and they went to the same stall. Who cares? They're young and they're exploring and they're figuring things out. And so I think that there is something already established within us as Americans, within the culture that is the norm about what we expect from certain students. And we feed into that. That's why expectations are so important. And I think, again, there hasn't been a lot of study about what's going on with the Asian population. And that yet we just kind of feel like, oh, everything's fine and they're going to work it out and they're going to fix it within their community. And we've decided that other communities are broken and they won't be able to fix it.
Yeah.
Both of you.
I will say this, so a couple of things. Number one, we talk about implicit and unconscious biases, and we have biases against and towards people, and it doesn't necessarily mean white people have biases towards blacks, etc. In fact, what we found out even in research is that black teachers have biases towards black students. So we all have biases towards each other, and those biases work a number of ways. So there's an expectation often that Asian children will excel. Even when you look at the data and the testing doesn't support that, right, for that individual student. There is something about dismantling minority myth complex. And it's actually important because Asians are a huge category. There are a lot of different populations within Asian. And when you begin to disaggregate the data, which our governor doesn't want to do because he doesn't like data, but that's another conversation, you see that groups of students, like Hmong students or Southeast Asian students, some segments of Filipino students. If you look at a number of different types of students within that, they're not doing as well. Even though they're Asian, they're not doing well. In fact, Hmong are probably some of the most underrepresented students in college, although we assume, oh, those students are doing well. So we're going to have to dismantle what we think of the Asian category. All Asian students are not doing well. All of them are not achieving. And many of them are low income and still trying to do well within systems. So I just want to challenge our assumptions around Asian students because all of it's not true.
And I'd like to add in terms of discipline, I agree with everything Discipline said. The numbers don't indicate that Asian Americans are getting disproportionately suspended and expelled. That's the data, that's just not there, that's just not happening. And it could have to do with stereotypes about Asian Americans. So that's why we're talking about Latinos and African Americans.
The warriors are still up. Ryan, let's talk about, and everyone, let's talk about school funding.
Yep.
And could you start us off with explaining to us what is local accountability control? The formula, why was it put in place? What was its intention, and what is its impact?
Yep.
Thank you.
So again, show of hands, how many of us have heard equity? Often people talk about equity and all of that. Have you heard that recently? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I will say this, and I want to start here. Equity is, and I say this often, equity is like the new coconut water. It's like the trend everybody's talking about, but not everybody's drinking, right? So you hear equity up and down the street, everything's equity, and what we're doing is around equity. But equity is not just about a conversation, it's about outcomes. So if you don't know this, the entire state has moved to a new funding formula for schools. It's called the Local Control Funding Formula. Oftentimes it's titled LCFF. And it's actually predicated on this idea of equity, that in order to ensure that we close achievement opportunity gaps, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing some of the most vulnerable students. So the way that we fund schools now, we used to be categorical funding. Now, if a district has a higher concentration of English language learners, foster youth, and low-income students, and homeless students, they receive more money, more concentration supplemental dollars than districts who don't have a high proportion of those students. Now, all schools receive a certain amount of base funding, but you receive money on top of that based on the concentration, the percentages of those students. So you're seeing, like, LUSD, and they're actually in the headlines for not spending this money correctly, $1.1 billion of LCFF funding. But dig this, that money is totally flexible. So the conversation now is the students who are generating that funding, our district's actually even spending it on those students. And what our research has shown in the first couple of years, most of that money was spent to restore many programs that were cut during the Great Recession, to increase teacher salaries in some places, and to backfill a number of programs that might have gone away as well. So there is a conversation about, well, if this money is being generated on the backs of these students, should we not be spending it to ensure that these students are accelerating? There is a plan called the LCAP. This is going to get all weedy, but if you read it, it's like a 10th grader reading Crime and Punishment in the dark. You can't tell where money's going, it's duplicative, and it's supposed to be the way you track this money. So you can imagine there's millions of dollars being spent supporting equity, and we have no sense of if it's actually getting the results necessary for our students. So we're excited about it, we supported it, but once again, if we're about equity, we're about outcomes. That money's be spent correctly, and we're currently in the process of data collection on a report about how that money is actually being spent at the school level. And we're taking a number of districts, and that will come out in the fall to give us a sense of how the money's really being spent. But we're taxpayers here, all of us here. We should know how that money is being spent. Budgets are important, so yes. I could go on for an hour just on LCFF.
This is great, and I want to go into Eva and Cheryl. I'm coming to you. We just heard sort of a big picture discussion around the LCFF. From your vantage point, what are some of the policy issues and the big picture issues emerging from this funding formula? And then I'm going to go to you, Cheryl. We're going to talk about what you're seeing in schools.
I just want to say, Lord have mercy. Because in one school district, they took tons of money to spend on police. And that, it isn't helping these kids. And basically, what they were doing is just what Ryan said. They wanted to take the money that's supposed to help the kids and pay for things they were going to pay for anyway. The other thing is that they're supposed to have input from the community, and they don't. The community can say this and that, and then they just basically ignore them. Also, the districts, in Antioch yesterday, they said the district is just awash in money, but they have no idea what the money's going for at all. And the teachers were saying they need more resources to deal with the discipline, but they don't know how to get the money that's coming from the state to make this happen. So it's really, I want to connect with you after this, because there's a couple of school districts I'd like you to add to the study. And then, yes, this is public. We're involved in this situation in one school district where we brought in some implicit bias experts, and the school district has stonewalled us, blocked us, delayed paying the experts, and in their LCAP report, they said we spent all this money and we're working cooperatively with the implicit bias experts. It's just a lie. It's just a lie. We think it's going to pay their lawyers to block, literally to block us. So it's a real shame. And I'd love to connect with you to talk to Governor Brown about disaggregating the data, because that's critical. So can we talk?
Cheryl, with this picture of this funding formula, what are you seeing as a result of it in schools, on the ground, with the students that you're working with, and how is it affecting the programs?
So I mean, it's basically ditto, right? So it's not trickling down the way that you would want it to or expect it to. It's going to where it was going to go anyway. I remember earlier this year, or last year, end of last year, I'd gone to a Policy Link event, and they were talking about LCAP, and they were talking about the local control funding, and the general consensus was that the community meetings are a stage, right? It's just to come in and say that they've done it, and that they don't actually use the input from community to inform what happens next. And that when people do try to follow up, they are stonewalled. And so, the San Francisco superintendent is all about equity, and he uses the language, and he has all of this conversation. And, you know, the question is, again, to your point, where is it actually? Like, how do we comb through, how do we dig through, how do we see how it's actually impacting? Because we can't see it. There is no there. And so that is the real struggle. We have been working with different offices to do the community meetings, but again, the folks who are actually supposed to benefit from it, the folks who are bringing the money in, they're not bringing it to them in a way that they understand it, or here's the real issue, here's the real struggle. If those folks are already feeling left out and forgotten and omitted and feeling hopeless, why would they come to a school district meeting to talk about the LCAP, which they don't know what that means and what it stands for, or the LCFF, which they, you know, sometimes they think it's just a setup to come in and talk about how horrible your child is. So they avoid those school meetings, and a lot of them have the issues that their kids have. They have that same issue when they were growing up, so it's just like going back to the principal's office again. So they're like, I don't want to go to the school because I'm going to get in trouble. And so it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. We've had meetings with the LCAP folks who are supposed to do the convenings. We brought them in to talk to service providers, because those are the folks who have the direct relationship with the families, because that's who's picking kids up at 6 o'clock in the evening and learning what's going on. Even the service providers like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Where's the money? How come it's not actually getting to us that actually do the work? What do the partnerships look like? Who's informing your decisions to talk about what the curriculum is, or what's important, or what's valuable, or what the timeline is? It just isn't happening, and people are very disgruntled. But I feel like the people that are disgruntled don't understand the process and don't have access, or their voices don't count.
What's the entry point for a citizen to touch this funding model? How does someone come in to have their voice heard or their perspective?
So every district, as they've mentioned, is supposed to have a broad-scale community engagement program, program that provides feedback from community members, from parents, from students, teachers, but it's variable. So there's some districts who are actually doing some remarkable things, trying to meet parents where they're at, and there's some districts who are basically doing compliance. They'll have a room like this and say, well, only 4 parents showed up, we did it. Right, and there's no quality assurance to make sure that that's happening. So we've actually have a memo of best practices around how do you really engage communities, and how do you do this in a way that's about partnership. That's really powerful. But I recommend that you go to those meetings, and if you're not seeing the type of transparency necessary, you say we should do something about it. If you voted for Prop 30 to ensure that we have some stability in school funding, and you care about this issue, because many of those funds come from that, and we're going to be voting to re-up Prop 30 soon. So this is very important because it connects to the outcomes. We want to make sure spending is not just to give us a boost. And I will say this, our governor recently in an article, when was asked the question about should LCFF close achievement gaps, he says, why are you talking about that? He says something as asinine to me as saying, well, if we close the achievement gap, who are going to be our window washers? Who are going to be our waiters? Do we get robots to do that? Which is like, whoo. So when we talk about the belief gap and why we do this work, he said, well, it's supposed to be just a boost, but no. We need to collectively say to Governor Brown and the governors who will come after him that we want to see these gaps closed. And it's your responsibility to figure this out, especially if it's on our dime. And I think that's a really important part that we can play in the community.
Sheryl, start us off. I want to talk about impact and what's working and what's not working. So positive and negative impact. We think about programs that help advance self-esteem, restorative justice programs, mentoring programs, charter schools as an approach to change the context for young people. What are you seeing in terms of actual impact that's working really well to support African American and Latino students and those who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and those that are maybe doing more harm than good?
We're here and we're having these conversations about biases, and I love the idea to really share with folks that don't assume that, African-American teacher is going to love having a class full of African-American students. Sometimes it's actually just the opposite. They're a little bit more upset. And I think we have been in San Francisco, we're working with the mayor's office and other folks to really talk about like best practices and what works and what we should be doing to change the narrative. And part of that is the training, right? It is about like, how do we talk to people about who's coming into their classroom and how do you make a welcoming space and what does that look like? I know that for us, the struggle has really been about, and this is coming up more and more, about the curriculum itself and how the curriculum is shared and what does that look like. We are, this year, the one thing that, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about trauma-informed care and what that looks like. And I've been working with San Francisco Unified. They just launched their African American Leadership Initiative 2 years ago. And we've really been focused on some of the post-secondary pathway things. And so I think what for us has been most critical are partnerships, right? That we understand the school day is 6 hours of the day, right? And then where are those kids the other 18 hours? And what is that connection? What is that relationship? How do we build that bond? And how do we leverage that? That is really important. The relationship, the connection is really important, especially when we're talking about trauma. Just this week, I've been in 2 meetings about 2 different students. One, a girl who was extremely bright, one, a kindergartner who is reading at level A. And both conversations were different but the same. The principal saying to me, yes, I know we're not supposed to do suspensions, but the teacher calls the mom and is like, I think he's having a rough day, you should come get him. So what's that message say to that mom? And this mom, who watched her uncle get his brains blown out when she was in 2nd grade, whose mother was killed when she was in 4th grade, has all this trauma and is now raising her kids in the same way that she was raised. So we can't tackle it just from the academics of the classroom. If we are not looking at social emotional therapy, what are they eating, where are they living, all of these other things, we'll never be able to solve it. So we have to really begin to dig deeper. I know that Nadine Burke-Harris in San Francisco is doing the Center for Youth Wellness, which is really looking at the ACEs, the adverse childhood effects of trauma. I know when we went with JCRC to Israel and we visited Sderot, one of the things that we came back with is what's going on when folks are in these traumatic environments to create a safe space. That it's not just about the physical, but it's also about the emotional and the fear of how somebody's going to react when I walk into the room. What is that coming from? Am I in danger? Are they in danger? Like all of these different things, we can't get to the academic learning until we deal with what's in the heart and what's really in the soul, right? In terms of what keeps them from being able to succeed. So for me, the most important piece is figuring out what's really going on inside and drilling down on that, not just from the kids' perspective, but from the teacher and the adults and the folks that are supposed to be in that community. That, to me, is what's going to make the change and take us further.
And Ryan, what are you seeing in terms of impact as related to management development programs, on My Brother's Keeper? You know, what's the practice and data telling you about the impact on the learning and school experience of African American and Latino youth?
So one trend that we have seen, and it's outlined in our Black Minds Matter report, is because you may have heard the president's My Brother's Keepers program. Well, that has started numerous programs across the country really dedicated to turning the curve on the data for particularly Black male students, who honestly are overrepresented in almost every indicator connected to failure and underrepresented in every indicator connected to success. So it's really this issue of what is there a call to action there? We mentioned a little bit about Oakland. So Oakland started the AMA program, the African American Male Achievement Program, a number of years ago because, quite frankly, Black male students within Oakland Unified performed the worst out of all districts across the state. So they really had a call to action about what can we do to ensure that these young men actually graduate. So they've done some novel things there. Chris Chapman actually runs that work. They started a manhood development class that are actually taught predominantly by Black male teachers that help provide supports both academically and personally so that these students can succeed. And we've already seen some impacts. Number one, there's a teacher shortage if you haven't heard. 90% of the teachers, the black male teachers who come into this program are retained. They have a 90% retention rate. That is fantastic. And one thing Chris will tell you is that he actually recruits teachers where we don't recruit teachers. We often think, well, teachers come from the sky and and are made, but honestly, there are amazing community organizers who be teachers. There are amazing people who work within communities who are tutors, and we never actually help support that work. He does that in his program, and it's actually really supporting and helping. Impact's there. They've seen a 10% graduation rate increase for black male youth who've gone through that program. That's pretty remarkable in Oakland. They've seen 8% increase in some of the students who are actually meeting standards in English, which is great. And they've seen a 20% jump in attendance rates of these students as well. So that is really positive work. San Francisco also has a My Brothers, My Sisters Keepers program that starts to put these things together. So there's an emerging trend on, well, maybe we can do something specifically targeted for these students in order to see success.
Thank you. Eva, let's go to you, and talking about impact and outcome, from your perspective around practices and policies, if you were able to shift some pieces of the ecosystem, what would you push, what would you pull?
As I'm listening, I'm thinking that many of our folks are so isolated. Like here we're in this beautiful, beautiful setting, yet there are people in Oakland who, I live in Oakland, there are people I don't see there who are suffering. So how do we have a sense of community and that we're all in this together, and that I have a role to play in this. It's easy for me to say I'm going to sue folks, but what am I doing to make things better? So how do we get away from it being an us versus them? And I don't know how to actualize that. I don't, but somehow we've got to figure out that we're in this together. Yeah, that's all I would say.
We're going to shift gears and we're going to talk a little about public policy and advocacy. I will also let you all know that the Warriors are just about 20 points ahead. Wait, 13 points ahead. So,
what quarter?
I can't, it's not true.
3.5 minutes to go.
That's it?
Yeah.
And they're at 97, and so when you take a
Right.
100,
3.5.
that's a good place for the Warriors. Let's talk about policy and legalities and advocacy. And Eva, would you start us off by talking with us a little bit about how you are using the tools of the legal system to advocate for the issues that we're discussing in this evening?
We try to work cooperatively with people, but if they don't act right, we will sue them. And in Bakersfield, where we are, every black man I have met there, has been in prison. And they're fabulous, wonderful men. They've been pushed out of school, right into prison. It's startling. So they are used to being ignored by the school district. And so the fact that we have sued the school district, and the school district keeps trying to get our case dismissed, and we win. And so it's having the power of the law behind you. I mean, that's why I'm a lawyer. So there's this little town called Arvin near Bakersfield. It's all Latino. I was like the only black person in the town, literally. And we were talking to folks, and they do things like they lock the Latino kids out of the classroom and don't let them in, and then suspend. One kid was so mad, he came back in and knocked over a computer, because the computer cost more than $500. They called in the police arrested him and took him away. So there's a concept in law called you're not allowed to perpetuate a racially hostile educational environment, and there is one in Bakersfield. So we're able to bring these concepts in. People who have been just thinking they had to just take it, they don't have to take it. And I don't know if we'll win, but they like the fact that there are lawyers there fighting for them. And you want to be cooperative, and we are working cooperatively in some jurisdictions, but and I don't mean to sound so mean, but it's like, hey, if you don't act right, we're going to sue you. And we like suing people. So I often, the whole show Roots is on now, and I have trouble watching it because it's so painful. It's so painful. but I think of what my ancestors would feel if they know I can sue some of these people. They called Bakersfield, Calabama. And so sometimes you need the carrot, but sometimes you need the stick. So that's partially what we do.
Thank you, and
And
Ryan?
we're also going to have a conference in the Bay Area next spring about mind science and how these concepts can be used to help us understand ourselves and how they can be used to transform society. So I'll make sure that you all get an invitation to that. So it's not just suing people, we're not just mean, but we can be. But we also want to give people tools to think about how they're doing things. Because when we do these presentations on mind science, people go, oh, I see. And it isn't just white people who have biases. I remember when they were talking about Hurricane Andrew and they were talking about looters. When I heard the word looter, I thought black person. That's very biased. But when I say that, people go, oh, you too, and then they start oversharing the things that they have thought. And I go, sit down. But and we're going to talk about this later. Race is so hard to deal with, and because it's so uncomfortable, we don't talk about it and we don't deal with it. So I very much salute you all for doing this.
Thank you. Ryan, from the work that you're doing, what are the innovative public policy issues that you're advocating for, or what levels are you pushing and pulling out there that you think will best address the disparities we've been talking about this evening?
Yeah, so we're a state advocacy group. So a lot of the work that we do is around how do we change laws that will support Black, brown, and low-income students. A big issue right now is accountability, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but right now California's trying to decide for probably, which is going to basically be an important decision for the next generation, how do we determine what makes a good school, and how do we measure it, and how do we tell people that? They're redesigning it because we have a new federal law, because of LCFF. So we're really fighting for no school should be considered good in this state if Black, brown, and poor children are failing. That should be something we all no school should be considered good in this state if Black, brown, and poor children are failing. There was a time in California where you had schools where on average it looked good, but when you looked at the subgroups and you look at the data, most of the low-income students were failing. Most of your Latino students were failing, but on average students were doing good. But we know that's not the case. We have to know that a school is a quality school if all students are achieving, that we have high expectations for that, and we're currently fighting the good fight. But I'm gonna do this because I was really inspired by Rabbi Heath. You know, Rabbi Heath reminded me of one of my favorite quotes by civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. And the crux of it, if you know Fannie Lou Hamer, was a woman who literally started a revolution at a Democratic convention in order to say that Black people really matter. And she said something that was really profound. She said, nobody is free until everybody is free. Nobody is free until everybody is free. When we talk about the work we do as a community, because we are a collective here, whether you're Black or brown, whether you're rich or poor, how are we making education an issue that we care about? Are we voting in our school boards? Are we marching to Sacramento? Are we making our voice heard about the achievement gap? In communities that may not look like us, are we saying, well, what are you doing about the Black students in Oakland? What are you doing about the Latino students in Calabama? That's an issue that matters to me. And I'm willing to talk about that from my pockets. I'm willing to talk about that from the voting booth. I'm willing to talk about that from the bully pulpit. And I'm willing to march down the street with a sign and say, you care about these kids because they are our kids. They are the majority of this state. So we collectively have to believe we can close the achievement gap in this generation. We have to collectively believe that every student can succeed no matter what. And that has to be something that we have to challenge ourselves to do. Because if we don't build a political will, it's always going to be the same old, same old. So I'm all about this being a movement about people in education, not just about policy.
I'd like to riff off something you said earlier that made me want to cry. the notion that Governor Brown said, he said that, who's gonna watch the
On the
Windows?
records, come matter, I can forward it to you.
I believe it, but it's just so stunning.
Yeah.
If we complain about that, it's those black folks. Y'all, seriously, need to jam him up. You need to let him know that is not acceptable. I mean, that's just horrible. And we talk about structural racism. That's how structural racism works. The governor of the state thinks it's okay that there's an achievement gap so people can wash the damn windows. You can move him more than we can.
Cheryl, what are we gonna do? We have a community of committed people. We heard you about marching in the legislative offices, marching on the streets for whatever your entry point is to advocacy, and that's what we do as a Jewish community. From what you're seeing in the classrooms, what you're seeing across the organizations you're working with, what are we gonna do as a committed community who wants to affect change?
Definitely off the top, there are a few things that come to my mind. First off, we do a literacy program with University of San Francisco that targets 175 students, predominantly African American in San Francisco. And when I was working with Doug and other folks and talking about how can we work together, how do we build partnership, Jewish Coalition for Literacy has been amazing. It was this automatic, like, school's out during the summer. How do we leverage something that's already in place to support something during the summer? And put the call out to have people actually come and tutor and support and be a body in that place. The other thing is last summer we launched an internship program specifically for students, really addressing the access and the opportunity. And it was specifically for students who were going to be last minute or who weren't going to fill out their forms or who were going to have a struggle or whose parents didn't understand something. And it was focused on building a bridge between law enforcement and communities of color. When we first went to folks in the police department and other folks and said, look, we want to do this internship. We want it to be something similar to what we see in other schools where kids have access and they have families or friends who help them with that. Their initial response kind of was like, those kids can't do that, right? And we went through the process, did the program over the course of the summer. At the end of the summer, some of the police officers said to me, oh my God, those kids have really changed over the summer. And I said, actually, they didn't change. Your perception of them changed, right? And when it came time during the school year, those groups continued. We had these forums working with police. We actually had 4 kids after the summer. We had 70 kids. Of the 70, 14 were old enough to actually apply to be in the cadet program. 4 of them are in the cadet program. 2 of them are applying to be police officers. They're all youth of color, all come from poor backgrounds. And when it came time to talk about funding this issue again, we were told, look, you gotta have more than this group of folks say that this is a good thing. And I was really grateful when Joe Goldman shared that he had written to the mayor's office and said, this is something that needs to happen. Chief Sir, before he resigned, actually put $150,000 in the budget to make sure that that program continued. When other folks started to write letters and say that we think this is beneficial, we think that we need to do more in this area, now the mayor's office is actually looking at how do we build a pot that's bigger than $150,000 to change where this pipeline is going. Right, so those are things that are really important. I think joining the chorus, right, sharing your voice, which has already been said, to find a way to volunteer, to say, I say to folks that the tech companies all the time, it's not that I want tech companies to go away. I want to figure out how to get my kids in those jobs in the tech companies. And when the tech people actually see the people that are in that community, it makes a huge difference. So see us, right? See the kids, see the community, see the center. Go in there, right, and volunteer. Not always about where they're coming to you or where you feel safe, but go to those places, be there, because even when the kids aren't there, when they've come in and somebody's painted a wall or put their name up or left a stack, they get really excited because now all of a sudden, right, somebody didn't come visit them in prison. They came to visit them at a community center. They came to write them a letter at a space to say, I think you can read this letter, and I think you can respond to this letter. So those are the things, join the chorus, make some time and write a letter and make sure that everybody knows that it's not just a Black issue, it is a neighborhood, it is a community, it is a city, it is a state, it is a nation issue.
You've got 6 minutes left. You've gone for more than an hour. I want to just acknowledge, I was only able to weave in 8 questions that came in from the audience. There are another 8 that I was not able to get to, and we will get them to our panelists because they're great questions. We just don't have enough time. I'm going to give you each 2 minutes. You have a captive, engaged, committed audience. What do you want them to know? What do you want them to tell them on their way out of this conversation while they carry forward the messages that we've given them this evening?
I'm on Twitter a lot, trying to keep up with some of our presidential. But there's a term out called stay woke, and it's the notion of stay awake. So you've heard some stuff today, stay woke, and engage in conversations with people. The Jewish community is, I hope this isn't anti-Semitic to say this, it's a very powerful community, and you've got a lot of clout, and you can help us. And you've heard some concrete things here that people are doing, get behind what they're up to. So there's just lots you can do. If you hear people saying ridiculous things, speak up. We will speak up if we hear people saying anti-Semitic things. But stay woke. We're in a crisis, and you can help. That's what I would say.
We just finished getting ready for summer, and yesterday I did this. We were doing some curriculum training and did this poem and this activity with folks, right? And you mentioned earlier this post-racial society, and we talked a little bit about, I don't know if folks are, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Langston Hughes, and so we went over the poem Dream Deferred, right? What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or does it fester like a sore and then run? And we started to talk with the folks about like, so let's take the dream of King, right? And let's talk about where we are right now and have that as an understanding of what may be going on in this community, right? What happens to a dream deferred? Has the dream been realized? Because some people would say, oh yes, we have a black president. But does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or people just like it's never going to happen, that dream is done? Does it fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Are people just over it, like I don't want to hear it anymore, like it's done? Or does it crust and sugar over and it's like a syrupy sweet? That's the part where it's like, we've done it, right? Or does it sag like a heavy load? And then the one that I think we're seeing with like the Black Lives Matter and the movements that are happening, does it explode? Are people just so tired of talking about the dream that they want to see it realized, that there's explosions happening? I really say, question, right? When people say that we're there, we've done it, really think about it. And understand what's going on with folks, because a lot of it is about this dream deferred and how it's being manifested in the lives of folks. Just to really think about that it's not that people are lazy or slothful. It's the dream deferred and how it's impacting them.
I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've learned so much just from you two, and can't wait to follow up even as we're expanding. So, and congratulations on the way.
You won?
Yes. So, a couple things. One, it's funny, I was supposed to pick up my mother at the airport today, and she missed her flight. Part of me feels good about this morning, feels really bad about that. But I love my mother, and she spent her entire life savings to move me from grew up in East Palo Alto, spent her entire life savings to move me from one community to another because she heard that young black men graduated from that high school and went to college. Part of me is excited because the sacrifice is the reason I'm sitting in front of you. But part of me is angered because no one should have to spend their life savings to find a good quality public school. They should be in every community, including East Palo Alto, including Watts, including Bakersfield. So there's a couple concrete things I'm going to ask you because I'm an advocate. One, we do these data equity walks to help people realize that the issue is real. I'm going to ask you, if you know a community, if you know a house talk, if you know a party where you should be having this conversation and people need to know this data, because you're usually the good people. We're preachers of the choir if you're here during a Warriors game to listen to this. But the people who should be in here are not. So I would challenge you to do a data equity walk. We also have AB 2548 that we are currently trying to push through the California Senate about accountability, about schools disaggregating data and saying that no school is good if black, brown, and poor children are failing. We have some cards here. I'd love for you to fill that out. Lastly, get to know the work we're doing. and become allies and champions of their work. We all can be equity champions in this room. And I believe, and you're gonna be way more effective in a lot more circles than I can even be. So I ask you to dedicate yourselves to these issues of equity and race and accountability today. And I'd love to help you do that.
With that, I'd like to thank our three panelists. We're going to do some more live polling with you to see how our perspectives have shifted, grown, evolved over the course of the evening. So thank you.